Donna, the thing about the ChatGPT thing is that really you could say that about any person in this room because it's just a form of words strung together. And I think that what's missing in these introductions is the other half of the communicative dyad that's always present when somebody speaks to somebody else, the listener as well as the person doing the talking. No better person to illuminate the path forward, but illuminate for whom and why is somebody even seeking illumination from you at all? And I'm deeply grateful to the organizers and inviters of this group and the team behind them that they have left plenty of time for discussion afterwards. And I think that that's, really where the contribution comes into focus. And, you are all coming from the field of education or contiguous to the field of education. And I think even though the etymology is something about leading people out, it's really much more important to think about the people and why anybody is needing to be led from anywhere to anywhere. And coming as I do from the US with the news of the last 24 hours sort of circulating in the wider digital sphere, the question whether the leaders we currently have are the right leaders for the people is, maybe even more uppermost in my mind. So how do the people lead their leaders is, in a way, a subtext for this first opening talk in the symposium, which was on the broad subject of AI and democracy. So not AI and education per se. So a very specific thanks to George, who nabbed me almost a year ago now to ask me to play a part in this symposium, and also to Immaculate for being willing to respond without troubling me to send notes, slides, and various other things in advance. I have to say I've really appreciated that courtesy. And Mike and Donna, your hospitality and your backup in all kinds of ways. Mike, for guiding me around your incredibly beautiful campus today. That's been a really extraordinary gesture of welcome. But then when I come to Canada, I always experience welcome in a way that I'm not sure we know how to reciprocate south of the border. But if you come to visit Cambridge, I will reciprocate. And with that as introductions, let me move on to the topic of today's talk. Well, so many people like to point to specific moments in time for when a topic comes into focus, and very often a moment they pick is 1996, of all places in Davos, Switzerland, better known for the World Economic Forum, but it was also the location where John Perry Barlow, former lyricist of the Grateful Dead and recently deceased, declared a manifesto on cyber independence. And the rhetoric was very inflated. It reads in a kind of passionate, rhetorical way that, sort of invites people to believe. So, governments of the industrial world, you weary giants of flesh and steel, on behalf of the future, I ask you of the past to leave us alone. But the sentence that particularly grabs me, because my training is in law originally, and hence in political theory and politics, is you have no sovereignty where we gather. So you are not the rulers, you governments of flesh and steel, whoever those are. The sovereign space is being reclaimed on behalf of somebody else. And ideally, that somebody else is anybody who walks into this nearly liberated sphere, the digital sphere, where the rules and regulations and constraints and bonds of that old material world will no longer apply. So that was the promise. It was a promise of progress, but a promise of human progress, not just of technological progress, that this technology would make us free to be ourselves in ways that had not been imagined. And if you go back to the writings of many of my colleagues in political science and in public policy from about the turn of the century, everybody imagined that cyberspace would be a space where people could express themselves as members of a demos in ways they had not been able to express themselves before, because everybody would have this portal at their fingertips and they would be able to write and say and think whatever they wanted. What people didn't ask is, okay, great, here is a doorway, it opens into a space, but what's on the other side? So what is the future that people want to lead to? I mean, is it the case that having open access to a space of self-expression in itself makes a democracy? It's striking to historians and theorists of democracy that 2,000 plus years of thinking about what makes a good democracy didn't figure. People mistook access and voice for everything to do with the formation of publics and what kind of rule would ensue if you gave everybody a chance to simply express themselves. So I've put there a sort of history of bridges of different sorts, and you may recognize Sydney and Brooklyn if you're aficionados of bridges. But if you're bridging from one place to another, if it's a temporal era from the present to the future, what is this future that we're aspiring toward? And I think education as a word has that same philosophical conundrum built into it. It etymologically focuses on the being led out of, but being led into what is, in a way, the more important of these questions. So I didn't use ChatGPT, but I did run a little search of one of my newspapers of choice, the New York Times, and I plugged in AI and democracy to see what headlines had appeared in the last year. And you see they're not optimistic headlines. So see how easily AI chatbots can be taught to spew disinformation, how AI tools could change India's election where a result is expected. It's the most known of expected results, but on June 4th, after 6 weeks or 7 weeks of polling across this giant country, AI wrote a housing bill. Critics say it's not intelligent. So artificial intelligence writes a bill that's not intelligent. So obviously there is some ironicizing going on there. And artificial intelligence and democracy, are they compatible? It's interesting that a widely recognized to be failed politician of the UK, Nick Clegg, has become the spokesperson for Meta and talks about its international affairs. So you can read the article for yourself and conclude whatever you want to conclude. But overall, the tenor of these headlines is not triumphalist. It's not John Perry Barlow. It's some other kind of thing. And this from July of last year, about a year ago, op-ed piece by colleagues of mine from MIT. Darren Acemoglu is a very eminent economist. I don't think he would as easily find a place at Harvard, but MIT is brave enough to accommodate him. But look at what he and his colleagues say. We believe the AI revolution could even usher in the dark prophecies envisioned by Karl Marx over a century ago. Then in the op-ed they say why Marx, in the classic version of Marx, was wrong, but the circumstances that Marx foresaw are closer to being the circumstances in which AI is being developed today. So Marx was convinced that capitalism naturally led to monopoly ownership, and then they say why that assumption was wrong at the time, and that oligarchs would use their economic clout to run the political system and keep workers poor. So their thesis in this article is that we are much closer today to imagining capitalism in that very tightly constrained form, oligarchy, that Marx foresaw. It wasn't right at his time because it turned out that the material technologies of the mid-19th century were smaller, more flexible, allowed for more competition and so on, than the digital platform technologies of our time that are more concentrated and come closer to being oligarchies. So these are not my pessimistic understandings. They're understandings that are shared widely among the engineers and developers, among even economists, and among some cross-section of policymakers and policy thinkers as well. So one can step back and say, you know, if instead of looking at how rapidly the technology is developing and how many millions and billions of dollars are being invested. I mean, the sort of standard measures of the gee whiz sort that you hear at the beginning of any AI talk is look how quickly it came on board, and look how many millions of people signed up on day one, and look how many billions have been invested, and you know, look how many industries it's already revolutionizing. And so, I mean, so it's all on the productionist end. But if you look the other way at what is the future that we want, whose rulership and what forms of governance do we care about, and what are the problems in any case that we want to see being governed, a very different picture emerges. So the question of who rules was already there in the Acemoglu quote that I gave you. The expertise is concentrated in relatively few hands. I mean, it's still the biggest companies are in Silicon Valley, and you know, it may be a highly international workforce by now, but you know, in the discussion we can talk about what even the internationalization of the Silicon Valley workforce means in terms of a global economy. The capital is extremely concentrated. Any measures that look at the top-level income inequality in the US show that income inequality is both rising and becoming more concentrated in fewer hands. Oxfam does this measure every January before the Davos meetings of the wealthiest individuals in the world, and what's not put beside it is that similar numbers apply to the US itself, that there are 3 or 4 or 5 people or families sometimes that own the wealth of half of the rest of the population. So this is concentration in a way that Karl Marx, you know, could only have dreamed about. And then, of course, there's the lack of transparency feature. So I had an interesting discussion with Mike this morning in which he was saying that even to do research on his area of computer science development, you have to work closely with the companies that are doing the applications, because the data are closely held and not shared unless, presumably, if you're working with them, you're under non-disclosure agreements and you operate de facto as part of the company. So, you know, certain kinds of problems are very hard to even measure statistically or come to recognize in a quantifiable sense that can be compared or tracked over a period of years and so on. Nevertheless, we know that there are behavioral impacts. I once, probably the only time in my life, had the opportunity to sit at a dinner with Eric Schmidt to my right and a number of the moguls of that industry, including you know, Sam Altman was 2 people down at the table. I mean, this is several years before ChatGPT. And they were talking about how they don't allow their children to spend time on computers and doing video games and so forth. So they were very aware of bullying and teen suicidality and so on. And the Attorney General of the US has released a report talking about the epidemic of loneliness. It's not my phrase, it's a phrase that's coming out of the medical domain. And just recently I saw that diagnoses of PTSD have jumped from something in the 3% range to the 7% range just over the last year among young adults. And these are not, I mean, they're showing symptoms of PTSD, but not with any of the classic triggers like they have been exposed to violent crimes or whatever. So somehow the symptomatology is there, even though the triggering events, the traumas that the psychiatry community recognizes are not the same trigger. So what is triggering the fact that an increasingly high percentage of young adults are feeling these symptoms that are they're pathological. I mean, they're classified as a disorder. And so who are the people being governed? I mean, in theory, it's we the people, but we know that these are incredibly surveilled societies now, that There are forms of addiction that involve social media, and that conspiracy theory is another of these things that's on the rise. So, the sort of, we will be free, we will be liberated, we will be able to express ourselves, we will have true democracies, sovereigns will be overthrown, and we will take back sovereignty. That seems to be a promise that's not exactly being kept. I mentioned before that my training is law, so I tend to stand back and say, well, if the question is about governance, surely there are constitutional level issues swirling below the surface, and can we identify those? If we want to make an analytic starting point that's not all about how many new millions of users of ChatGPT are on the table, but what should we care as members of constitutionally governed societies? The things that I, as a scholar of science and technology studies, focus in on are, where do science and technology enter in to create novel forms of life that we don't know what to do with? Ways of being together, but even ways of being. And because a lot of my work began with the biological sciences and is moving over to the information sciences and technologies, I do put the two of these technologies together in thinking analytically. So we've known for a long time that the biological sciences have thrown up quite challenging questions about what humanness is, because we've tinkered technologically with the beginnings and endings of life. And where does the human end and the non-human begin, and vice versa? This was being thought about in the biological sciences around the same time, but in different ways, from thinking about the human-machine interface and where does the one end and the other begin. I have a term, ontological surgery, that I use to refer to the fact that when you have these novel entities, you have to sort of carve them out of society, define them, and give them status in some way. So philosophers, moral philosophers, love the question, does X belong in my moral community? For instance, does a great ape have the same rights to existence and respect as a human being does? And, in the high-tech worlds, there are these entities, like what is the status of an IVF embryo, an embryo created outside the mother's body, or outside any person's body. And similarly, what is a data subject, the kind of crystallization of your informational self, what is its status? These are moments of ontological surgery in the sense that out of the morass of stuff, you have to identify this thing that you deem worthy of protection and worthy of constitutional recognition in some ways. And then a constitutionalist way of thinking can come into play, and you can think about, does this thing have rights? Does it have dignity? Is it property? Is it entitled to have property? And so on and so forth. I have to say that I was rather struck at Justice Alito's explanation for why flag number 2 could be flown at their beach residence, and he said, that house is in his wife's name, and she has sole title to the property, therefore she, as a private citizen of the United States, is entitled to express her freedom of speech. And this is not the upside-down flag, it's the other January 6th flag. But what struck me was that property rights were, in a way, transcending the ethic of anything else in the public sphere. That is, her right to express herself in any way she pleased was being tied to her ownership of property, and not to anything relational of the sort that we might think of, like you are married to a Supreme Court justice, and at least in traditionalist views of marriage, like Justice Alito buys into, man and wife are kind of considered the same entity, in his own religious thinking and so on. So, but that was, so where do Americans reach for justification is a kind of interesting question, and it has constitutional dimensions to it. All right, so another thing that somebody in my field thinks about is origin stories. Are these absolutely new things? It's very conventional for people at the forefront of technology to think that the world they see is utterly new. John Perry Barlow certainly saw cyberspace as a completely new domain. But is it new, or has it been percolating so that the questions have arisen elsewhere? And I would say that under these 4 different headings, these are not new questions in and of themselves. And we have some, at least, imagined answers that people have been thinking about. So playing God at the frontiers of technology, are you intervening in domains that, for whatever spiritual, religious, moral reasons, you should not be playing with? That you should take certain things as foundational and not to be disrupted. Then, obviously, the question of state surveillance has been with us for a very long time. Loss of control, but by loss of control, I mean loss of autonomy. I mean, so the human being's own autonomous position. And then intelligence. What is this thing that machine intelligence is? And, anybody who uses generative AI these days is told it's a statistical instrument. It simply collects the next word by the likelihood that it is the next word that out of a huge database would have been chosen. This is why, you can feed in a certain text and it doesn't matter who the subject is. There's a kind of sameness sound to the text that is going to be generated. And you can sort of sense a ChatGPT generated text when you're reading it from the nature of the syntax and the somehow the flatness of the expression that emerges out of it. All right, so with respect to playing God, one of my favorite starting points in the world of fiction is this film, which eventually produced a book out of it, Forbidden Planet. And I think it's interesting because of what the progenitor of the film foresaw and imagined. And I'm going to talk about it in the context of what I say analytically are 4 different traps that AI leads us into: inevitability, singularity, speed. Sorry, that last one is a mistake, but we'll come back to that. Anyway, so in Forbidden Planet, the Earth explorers go off in search of a lost prior group of explorers. And when they get to that Forbidden Planet, they find that there are only 2 people left from that original mission, a scientist and his daughter. And they find that there are these structures which are much more sophisticated than anything known on Earth, but they have funny shaped doors. So that's an image of one of those. And then they start talking about the fact of how all these people got destroyed, the predecessors from this other group. In 1956, this is before pharmaceutical drugs overtook talk therapy, and Freudianism was not yet dead, so the explanation of what happened is rooted in Freudian psychology. And what they discover is that there was an overstepping of bounds, a playing God, because the Krell, this incredibly advanced race, did not recognize the status of the id. So already in the text it says, what is the id? It's an obsolete term, I'm afraid, once used to describe the elementary basis of the subconscious mind. And so what happened when these people developed their incredible computerized intelligence and put it all together to develop a supra-intelligence was that the monsters from the id came into being. And then read the description. Like you, the Krell forgot one deadly danger, their own subconscious hate and lust for destruction, the beast, the mindless primitive. And so those mindless beasts had access to a machine that could never be shut down, the secret devil of every soul on the planet, all set free at once to loot and maim and take revenge and kill. So it's not a bad description of the Twitter sphere, and what got set loose. But we're talking about a 50-year interval, and, why did people not foresee that you let everybody's mind roam free, and the instincts that are set loose are not going to be only the beneficent ones? There's going to be some other things that are going on as well.
Hello, Hal, do you read me? Do you read me, Hal? Affirmative, Dave. I read you.
Open the pod bay doors, Hal.
I'm sorry, Dave. I'm afraid I can't do that.
What's the problem?
I think you know what the problem is just as well as I do.
What are you talking about, Hal?
This mission is too important for me to allow you to jeopardize it.
I don't know what you're talking about, Hal.
I know that you and Frank were planning to disconnect me, and I'm afraid that's something I cannot allow to happen.
Where the hell did you get that idea, Hal?
Dave, although you took very thorough precautions in the pod against my hearing you, I could see your lips move.
All right, Hal. I'll go in through the emergency airlock.
Without your space helmet, Dave, you're going to find that rather difficult.
Yeah, it's a famous scene, and it's iconic of any kind of disaster of a technological sort that you want to study historically. The designers thought of a lot of things, but there's a key missing ingredient, some things that they didn't think about, the O-ring on the Challenger that they didn't realize would freeze up at temperatures that were around freezing in Florida on the day of that launch, everything else they had thought about. So this is a fable, and, it's been written about over and over, and Arthur C. Clarke was asked himself about, what did he think of those predictions? And he says, nothing has happened since the making of 2001 to persuade him that his vision was fundamentally wrong. He said that every capability attributed to HAL, a system that can speak, listen, reason, criticize human art, and at one point even read lips, has been shown to be at least theoretically possible. So you don't need to wait till December 2022 and the unveiling of ChatGPT, and then everybody's sort of, hey, wow, I didn't think of it. This is like 25, 35, 50 years ago, people are imagining the world that we're making. So if they're imagining the world we're making, and people are imagining the dystopic consequences of the world we're making, why is it that the dystopic consequences land like they're surprises when they land? That is a serious question for democracy. What is it that people are forgetting in their lust for the technological frontier when people amongst us, the artists, the novelists, even the worriers about the philosophy of technology. You can go back to people like Martin Heidegger if you want, or Jacques Ellul, who came up in conversation yesterday. So it's thinkers, it's makers, it's doers, it's artists, it's anybody who has imaginative potential has already sort of been there, done that. So why is it that when you come to governance, suddenly we forget these lessons that seem to be existing perfectly happily on the side? Right, so turning to inevitability, this is what people in the computer science, electrical engineering, and so forth fields always tell us. Things have improved because there's a miniaturization, the power has increased. I don't know how often I've heard that this little gadget in your pocket has more computing power than the first, room-size computers that were ever built. And that in and of itself is taken as a good thing because, how could it not be a good thing? And it moves over into, other imaginations. So if the machine is evolving, so must we be evolving. And this is as good a sort of visual reminder of that famous Darwinian evolutionary image, but now converted over into the IT era that you could think of. So this is how people are thinking that, you stand tall and you're able to walk better because of these gadgets. And I read a harrowing story just a couple of days ago about a woman who accidentally fell, a very athletic, accomplished, beautiful woman, fell on a subway track, lost her arm and half of a leg. And what the story was about the prosthetic arm. And of course, it's an engineering marvel, but at least if you're my generation, you think of Luke being fitted out with his hand, but you also think of the moment when this woman is lying on the subway track. I'm sorry, I cannot get the one picture out of my head with the other picture, and they're like side by side. I mean, so do we need to inflict destruction before we cure destruction, or are we marveling at the cure without thinking about the thing that it's trying to remedy? I mean, that is, do we have to break before we restore? And if not, then, you know, where is the advance? All right, so what's wrong with the picture of progress? And I won't bother going into these things in detail, but these universalizing assumptions are there in the discourse on AI development, that there is this linear understanding of progress, and it erases a bunch of things. And I think that the problems for society lie more in the areas being erased than in the areas being constructed. And we can come back to talking about what one means by problem. All right, then there's this idea of the singularity, that if you just bump everything up scalarly and, you know, instead of curing things for 1 million people, you cure things for 1 billion people, that's better. Singularity University was built on that kind of presumption. But singularity of what? And certainly in education, my distinguished colleague Howard Gardner of the Harvard Education School has made a career out of unpacking the forms of intelligence. But when you talk about artificial intelligence, it suddenly all gets gone together. It's like one intelligence, and, you know, what about these multiple intelligences? And I don't need to say this to educators, but it's not like it's sitting in this neat colored diagram where everything is a triangle in and of itself. I mean, it's known that, for instance, musical and mathematical often have a correlation, and, you know, interpersonal and linguistic may have certain correlations that, you know, I know lots of people who have zero spatial understanding of the world but are perfectly good at doing mathematics. So, you know, it's not like you're everywhere at the same time and your mind is divided up into these neat co-equal triangles. There's a mixing and matching, and that happens in the biological realm in various complicated ways that we have no way of understanding at the moment. And then, not least, there are economic interests involved in fostering certain lines of research and promoting certain kinds of things. So Jack Dorsey's first ever tweet, I mean, you know, would you pay for it? What makes it worth 2.9 million? I mean, that is, where is this price even coming from? And what is the world that has priced it out? Now, economists like to think that the market is a perfect democracy because people's preferences guide the market. But if anybody studied the economics of art, you know that there's a lot of mediation involved, and, you know, or the economics of bookselling, for instance. So, you know, it's where is the money in the story of perfect democracy and perfect access? It's a question. A number of years ago, I wrote this book called The Ethics of Invention, and I wanted to point out that the ethical impulse or the ethical questions often arise very far upstream at the moments of invention. And if one transposes that into the technological domain of IT and AI, one sees that how intelligence gets commodified into AI and then put out in the world at large has a number of problems attached to it. So I, of course, come from a culture that has made a religion of the standardized test, although there things that always go on. A colleague of mine who teaches at Michigan, a historian, looked at the history of the Stanford Binet test, and the Binet in question came from France, but France never adopted standardized testing. And he made the argument in his book about the subject, the comparative book, that the French care more about a thing they call merit, whereas we care more about a thing that we call intelligence. Be that as it may, the ways in which we go about measuring it are different. I mean, the French send their children to elite schools, but at a different point in the educational system, and mathematics has a different place in the educational system in France, and so on, whereas we needed standardization for other purposes, and one of the most compelling pieces of his writing is to show that the standardized testing in America got a huge leg up because of the Army's need to pick people for the armed services, regardless of what high schools they had come out of in America, recognizing that there are immense socioeconomic disparities across America in the nature of basic education. So it was like the standardized test became a filter later on for picking out people to defend the country, and it was a very different sort of political economy. I don't need to talk to this group about algorithmic biases in general, but one of the most interesting very recent examples, long after people have started talking about biased algorithms, is what happened with the A-level exams in the school-leaving certificate exams in the UK during COVID. So they abandoned standardized testing because they didn't want to take the risk of putting people, even socially distanced, into the same testing place. But they recognized that they would need to do some kind of correction because of grade inflation. So they wanted to know how to compare. I mean, this fiasco has become enough of a story that it's actually in Wikipedia, and this is a little thumbnail description of it out of Wikipedia. But they use certain factors to correct for grade inflation. And what happened with those factors was it systematically gave an upward bump to already privileged private school students and relatively demoted public school students. So one of the factors they used was that they bumped up grades if they were given in smaller classrooms, evidently without noting that smaller classrooms had to do with richer schools, had to do with a different socioeconomic stratum. And this became so controversial that they had to withdraw the whole thing. But the things that strike me about it are this is happening in real time in a public discourse where algorithmic bias is already a term and everybody knows it, and the sort of stratification of school systems is already known and everybody knows it. So how in an aware society that invented Alan Turing, how do we still have these kinds of biases replicating themselves in real time in the here and now? So, that does raise questions about the who governs, and, we can come back because we don't have time to dwell on some of the answers that people have given, but a term of art that has taken hold is responsible research and innovation. So it's become its own abbreviation. You talk to this community and they say RRI is the answer. So, it's a thing that we might want to raise in discussion. All right, then another trap, that everything will be better because it'll be faster. And recently, I wasn't meaning for this to be a kind of piece of abstract art, but because I was a little bit away on a balcony, and because Eric Schmidt somehow is very ruddy, and because he was wearing bright red socks, this came out like a painting. But it's the real Eric Schmidt. I heard him say these things at Harvard not so long ago, October of 2023. So looking toward the future, Schmidt predicted, everyone will have an AI assistant in 3 to 5 years, and he added that productivity will double with the assistant. So this is the speed. In 3 to 5 years, productivity will double. That's a pretty big indicator of speed. And this is quoted out of our student newspaper, the Crimson. But first of all, does one want quickness? And of course, there is this very famous fable of the tortoise and the hare. So rapidity is associated with all of these kinds of things. If you followed the news of the latest spelling bee, there was a spell-off in which the two left standing at the end were given a list of words, and they had to run through in a fixed amount of time, spelling how many of them they got correctly. And the winner, a 12-year-old, somehow they're all South Asians. I mean, so this kid from a South Asian Texan, and apparently Texas really governs this area as well. It spelled 29 words in the however many seconds they were given. So, and debate winning, a couple of people have followed the history of policy debating as an educational training skill in America, and the speed with which policy debate winners actually utter sentences and words has increased by some measurable 30 to 50% over the last 20 years or whatever. So speed has been valorized as a thing that's good in and of itself. Well, I mean, if those are values, of course, a computer does those things faster than any of us would, so then it's valorized. But what about the other side? What about not IQ, but judgment? What about wisdom, not calculation? What about experience and not issue spotting? And what about tacit knowledge and not the ability to spout off spellings of words? And, that is the tortoise side of the story. So what are you speeding up? I mean, are you speeding Eric Schmidt's idea of productivity, what exactly is he imagining will be produced at a high enough level? In my other work, which is on biotech, we often use a chart like this to talk about whether democratic deliberation is taking place at the frontiers of biotechnology. And the very first thing we ask is the way in which the question is being posed itself generating, constraints on the nature of the deliberative process? Where are the questions coming from, not where are the answers coming from? So are there alternatives to the questions that are being posed? And then what's systematically not asked? So if you look at risk assessments, people often talk about the probability of harm and the magnitude of harm. But until fairly recently, in American environmental policy, they were not asking the question of who is the harm to. It took a separate social movement, the environmental justice movement, to alert the Environmental Protection Agency 25 years into its existence to the fact that it's not just an aggregate risk that we might be wanting to look at, but systematically and systemically are some people being put more at risk than others. So these are very slow learning curves that, matter to the way in which deliberative democracy might work. And then this last one, which to me is somehow the most provocative, the dispersal trap. And here I'm referring to the fact that we now exist in multiple versions. So, of course, we're familiar with the phenotypic version of the self, which is the version we have sitting around. But most of us by now have a biological chart of ourselves somewhere. There's DNA things that have been done. There's a big increase in neonatal testing and genetic records being produced. And increasingly also, of course, we have our digital selves. So you might think of the classic, traditional picture of the human in its binary gendered form in a classical work by an artist like Cranach, and next to that, the human of the DNA age, and then also the human of the digital age. And it's not that it's one or the other, it's that these are overlaid on each other in interesting and problematic ways. So when I think about that, my mind is led back to the fact that sacrality, even for the secular world, is tied up with ideas of the body and the respect that the body deserves. And this is Shakespeare's tomb, on which there are these, in Stratford, there are these very famous words. Good friend, for Jesus' sake, forbear to dig the dust and close it here. Blessed be the man that spares these stones, and cursed be he that moves my bones. So, of course, it's famous because it's Shakespeare and all of that, but it also expresses something. It expresses something about our feelings that there is something to the body that is different from just ordinary dust, and that people used to think that there was, no matter what the funeral rituals are, so even in a cremation religion like Hinduism, something happens to those remains that they should be taken to the Ganges or should be taken to some religious point of significance, and they're made part of the earth. It's not just to be left, unattended to. So the genetically distributed body leaves us with the question, well, so where is it? And there are all these different places where it is, and it has very different shapes, sizes, connotations, meanings, implications, all of which relate to this point about ontological surgery that I made before. So physically, where is the body? Is it in a cell line that's derived from your body, or is it somewhere else? Is it in a gene, or is it in the patent accorded to the gene? Spatially, where is it? Is it in a lab? Molecular biology, biological engineering people often talk about a disease in a dish. I was talking a couple of years ago, or a year ago, to a scientist with a child who has a pretty severe case of autism. And he said he had created a brain organoid of his son's brain in order to study the disease in a dish. And it was really poignant, because on the one hand, he's describing his experience as a father, and on the other hand, he's talking about the scientist. But it was, one of these moments where the thing in the dish and the thing and the person in the room who's needing 24/7 care and attention, they were sort of merging in metaphysically really weird ways. And, it makes one think about our imagination of the human and how it's being transformed. And then, of course, the temporal significance, which has become even more a problem in the digital age. So we have these extensions of life, and they're a place where moral thought can enter in, because we've legalized some of these extensions. We take our money and treat it as if it has a life independent of us, and we can decree for generations into the future, through a trust, what should happen. Databases, they have a life that's much different from the life of the people from whom the data have been extracted. Biobanks similarly for biological materials, and of course transhumanism now is an entire social movement that is saying, what about extending life beyond its normal barriers? And periodically people get very upset about these things, and there are these things that sociologists call moral panics. And one of those arose around this very famous lawsuit against Google, which gave birth to the idea of the right to be forgotten. Since I do comparative work, I was really struck by quotations from these two specialists in AI and digital democracy. Both of them have been colleagues of mine, but one is in Oxford and the other is at Harvard Law School. And they wrote roughly at the same time that this Google case, the Spanish case against Google, was being decided. And one of them is speaking in sort of Kantian terms, Victor Meyer-Schoenberger. If you're always tied to the past, it's difficult to grow and to change. So for an education audience, this is something that is worth reflecting on. Whereas for Jonathan Zittrain, how an individual's reputation is protected, a very different idea of privacy as a commodity that needs to be protected. And then you should leave that to the companies, because they really understand. So it's the judicial idea, legislation by a high court is institutionally mismatched. And so you might ask, well, what would a good match be? And so the American way is take the phenomenon, make it natural, turn it into a market, ideally privatize it, and then collectivize it into a good for society, but only when it has passed through the filter of being turned into a private commodity in the first place. Whereas, again, the comparative analysis is interesting, that the term data subject as an ontological term, a term describing a kind of being, comes into being in European legislative discussions and not our own. In America, everybody talks, in the US America, everybody talks about privacy all the time. But that assumes we know who the subject is. But in the European discourse, the data subject was made into a thing of its own, needing protection. And as I say, this all came to a head in this particular story of this rather befuddled-looking man, Marion Coseja Gonzalez, who had gone into debt once because of some fleeting marital problems. But then he found that every time anybody searched for his name, this indebtedness story was the one that popped up right away. And he thought this was a bad thing, and he took it to the European Court of Justice, and he won on the theory that information that, having all regard to all of the circumstances, is inadequate, irrelevant, no longer relevant, or excessive, does not belong on the internet. So this is what the crux of the right to be forgotten is, that there should not be this temporal gap between who we are sitting here and our expectations of how we can prolong our lives and this corporate entity, the data subject that is outside of our control, largely outside of our control, that can live forever and, appear in our lives to embarrass us in different ways. But we have created the prerequisites of a society where the presumption is not the moment you give over your data, it'll be erased. For instance, when I go through the facial scanners in my home airport, Logan Airport, it says as soon as my passport is verified, the facial detection will disappear. Of course, I, being me, don't really believe it, but at least in theory, that is the system. And maybe if you had infinite resources, you could sue the federal government if you discovered that they are actually holding on to it. And if you had a court that functioned, maybe you could get a judicial decision that, yes, they shouldn't be doing it. Anyway, these are all big ifs. All right, so coming back to democracy, all of this stuff raises the question in one's mind, who is the political subject in an age of technological convergence where the biological, the informational, and processing capability are all converging. And one should question the discourses in which people are talking about these things. So what is so urgent? I mean, what is this thing called productivity that we have to double in the next 5 years? And for what purpose? So that the US can win an imagined race with China over what? China's degree of surveillance being imported into the US and becoming the US degree of surveillance? And for what purpose in the end? People, even in the sciences, are using terms like slow science and responsible technology to fight back, to say, no, urgency is not the only thing. What about deliberation being inclusive? I mean, when you drive up to the School of Education, you see the Indigenous Center, right front and center. It's a very different understanding of even how a building should fit into its environment. And then objectives. I mean, are we even asking the right questions in a sense? So, where does one go? And I've suggested one goes to art, one goes to science fiction, and one goes to all kinds of things. But if one is a humanist at heart, and, I grew up in a language culture, Bengali, that makes fun of itself by saying within every Bengali there's a hidden poet. My father actually wrote poetry and worked with Rabindranath Tagore, who was the great poet of Bengal at the, approximately this time in the preceding century. But again, roughly 100 years old, and I think that we can take the thing away from war and reread futility in the light of AI and humanism. Was it for this the clay grew tall, or what made fatuous sunbeams toil to break earth's sleep at all?